So earlier today in my film photography class, we were learning about dodging and burning. And as my teacher was explaining it to me, I was like, yeah, kind of like the tool on Photoshop, right? And her response was, yeah, but Photoshop is pretty much just a fake, like, just...
Yeah, what photographers forget is that even before Photoshop, photographers were retouching images. Going back to the 1800s, you know, photography, what was it, 1870s, 1850s, 1870s, the first photograph was taken. But before the 1900s even hit, people were cutting up paper negatives and putting them back together, picking one image of somebody from here, another image from here, another image from here, and taking the best parts and putting that together as an image. And that's the same thing you're doing in Photoshop, just with more advanced tools. In the 1930s, 20s and 30s, George Harrell, who shot all of the Hollywood stars, he was shooting them on 8x10 film. He'd take a pencil and sandpaper and work on the negative, filling in areas, sanding areas off to soften them, and then he'd print the negative, and then he'd use paint and an airbrush, and they'd go back in and they'd work on it more and work on the shading and everything else. Then they'd re-photograph that and print that. So it's not like there's never been retouching. And dodging and burning, you know, it's just people changing what's on the image, which is what Photoshop does. People who knew Ansel Adams have said that Ansel Adams would have loved Photoshop, because everything he did with the zone system and targeting different areas of the exposure, and then he'd go in and he'd overdevelop the film or underdevelop the film to pull out areas, and then he'd over-process the prints to get certain densities of the print to come out, and it's all basically just a chemical version of Photoshop. And so people that knew Ansel Adams said he'd love it, because it was just a way to control what he saw and get his vision out there. And yeah, there's a lot of bad Photoshop. Sorry. There's a lot of bad Photoshop out there. And there's a lot of people who maybe aren't great photographers who use Photoshop to save their images. It's also funny to know that, like, photojournalism, for dodging and burning color correction, all the stuff that we did in traditional photography in the darkroom, they refer to that as toning, because they're not allowed to retouch their images, because that leads to a certain falsehood of the image, so that any of the media news-based image, the Time Magazine, Newsweek, New York Times, if they have an image that's retouched for an editorial or something like that, they say it's retouched or it's an editorial image. But photojournalistic and documentary images are supposed to be basically unmanipulated, except for maybe some dodging and burning, some color correction. So they refer to that as toning, so it's separate. You're doing it in Photoshop, or maybe you're doing it in Lightroom. It's still a form of retouching, no matter what people want to call it. And dodging and burning in the darkroom was a form of retouching. You know, it's just changing the reality of the image. So Photoshop, unless you're completely recreating things, which you can do, is no more or less fake than dodging and burning ever was. So, I mean, I can totally recreate, and I totally have recreated things in Photoshop, absolutely. And do you idealize things in Photoshop? Definitely. The fashion industry, everything's so rebuilt and recreated and smoothed out, and, you know, sometimes they'll add more hair by taking hair from 3 or 4 different images to give it volume and give it different wave and things like that. But it's all creating an idealized image. And people always say, you know, they'll go through a magazine and they'll say to me, oh, I know what's retouched. This image was retouched, and that image was retouched, and that image was retouched. Yeah, everything in the magazine was retouched. I would say most fashion magazines, People magazine, well, maybe not all the People magazine, because they have stuff where, you know, these celebrities are just like you. Some of that stuff's not retouched, but any advertising, it's all retouched, everything. So, you know, people need to, rather than say, oh, Photoshop's the bad thing, it's like, yeah, the fact that we believe it is the bad thing. The fact that we're not savvy enough to say nobody looks like that. It's like, oh, that model, she's too thin and she's so perfect. It's like, yeah, she has an hour of makeup. She's lit from the right side with beautiful lighting. they shot her with a long lens, which compresses the features and makes everything kind of fall into place. And then somebody did a couple hours of retouching on her. Of course she looks perfect. I mean, most people were taking selfies with our iPhone reversed, and the camera's just making our face wide. Of course we don't look as good. You know, so it's being critical of what you're looking at that's more important than saying, oh, Photoshop's fake. You know, photography's fake. It's always been fake. Even without retouching an image, you know, you could take a picture of somebody, two people making faces at each other, and I take a picture of just one of them, and they look insane. But if you give it the context of the other person, it becomes cute.
Yeah.
And so, as photographers, we lie all the time, depending on what we leave out of a photo. So, I don't see any problem with Photoshop, as long as, you know, it's used responsibly.
Yeah. Yeah.